An elephant stood frozen at the edge of the sanctuary, staring at a woman he hadn't seen in 2 decades. What happened when he stepped forward left everyone speechless. Dr. Eliza Rowan sat by her window watching the orange sun melt into the horizon. The days passed slower now, each one stitched with quiet routines. The old farmhouse she called home was far from the life she had once known, years of trekking through dense jungles, nursing wounded animals back to life, and standing face to face with the wild. Her hands, once steady with bandages and syringes, now held tea mugs and gardening gloves. Retirement had brought peace, but also a dull ache of absence. The animals were gone, the emergencies too. What remained was memory. That afternoon, the quiet was broken by a phone call. Eliza didn't recognize the number but answered out of habit. The voice on the other end was warm and familiar with a slight Kenyan accent. It was James, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. He was part of the team at a wildlife sanctuary in the Rift Valley. He spoke about a conservation summit happening next week. Researchers, scientists, and caretakers from around the world would be attending. They wanted Eliza there, not just as a guest, but as an honored figure, a pioneer in wildlife rehabilitation. She hesitated. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and traveling that far felt daunting. But James continued, mentioning something that made her heart pause. There had been unusual behavior from one of the older male elephants at the sanctuary. He had started lingering near the visitor observation area, staring into the distance and trumpeting softly. No aggression, just an odd, consistent presence. They couldn't explain it, but they thought perhaps she might want to see him. Eliza didn't answer right away. That evening, she pulled out an old photo album. Inside were fading photographs of her younger self, mud-streaked, laughing, arms draped around baby animals. Near the back of the album was a photo that caught her breath. A young elephant calf, no more than a year old, leaning against her with a bandaged leg and bright, trusting eyes. She hadn't thought of that calf in years. His name had once been the most spoken word in her world. The next morning, she confirmed her flight. Traveling again after so long stirred something within her. The airport lights felt too bright, the plane seats too narrow, but her heart beat with an energy she hadn't felt in years. As the flight descended over Nairobi, she looked down at the landscape. The open plains, the scattered trees, the color of the earth, it all looked unchanged. Time had passed, but this land had waited. James met her at the airport with a wide smile and a sign bearing her name. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but his warmth hadn't faded. On the drive to the sanctuary, he filled the silence with updates, new births, anti-poaching progress, and efforts to expand the reserve. She listened, nodding, her eyes watching the trees pass by. When they reached the sanctuary gates, something inside her shifted. It had been 2 decades, but the scent of dry grass and warm wind brought back waves of emotion. The place had grown. New enclosures, more staff, and research buildings stood where there had once been only canvas tents and dirt paths. Yet the heart of the place remained. This was still where the broken came to heal. They gave her a small guest house with a wide view of the reserve. That evening, she stood on the porch, watching distant shapes move against the twilight. Herds of elephants moved in slow procession, their outlines strong and peaceful. She could barely see them clearly, but something about their movements made her lean forward. One massive bull had stopped far from the others. It turned toward the lodge. Its ears flared briefly, and its trunk reached skyward. Then it lowered its head as if listening. A long, low trumpet followed, a sound that lingered in the air like a question. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She slept lightly that night, her dreams filled with soft rumbling sounds and dusty paths. Something was stirring, something she hadn't felt since she last walked away from this land. A call, quiet but persistent, echoing across years of silence. Morning light poured over the savannah as birds chattered in the trees. Eliza dressed slowly, her muscles stiff but willing. A jeep waited by the lodge, ready to take her on her first tour of the sanctuary. Staff members greeted her with nods and reverence. Some had heard of her, others had trained from manuals that included her research. She felt out of place at first, unsure of what role to take. But as they passed grazing antelope and giraffes dipping their necks to drink, the unease began to fade. By the time they approached the main elephant field, her heart was beating fast. Herds moved gracefully across the land. Mothers watched over calves, young bulls practiced mock charges, and old matriarchs led with slow certainty. Then, far in the distance, the same large male from the previous evening stepped forward. He stood taller than most, his tusks slightly uneven, and his gaze fixed directly on her. Eliza squinted, leaning forward in her seat. Her mouth felt dry. The bull took a few steps closer, then stopped. His ears fluttered once more, and he let out another long, deliberate trumpet. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something in that sound wasn't random. It was remembering. The jeep rolled to a stop near the shaded part of the observation deck. Eliza stepped down slowly, her legs stiff from the ride but her mind alert. A guide offered to assist her, but she waved it off gently. Her eyes never left the large elephant standing at a distance. He hadn't moved since the moment he had trumpeted, still fixed in place, watching. Other elephants ambled past him, some brushing their flanks against his, others pausing to graze. Yet he stood still, unwavering in his attention. Eliza remained at the deck, a barrier of wood and rope separating her from the open field. The morning air carried the soft rustling of grass, the clicks of insects, and the occasional call of birds overhead. Still, her focus stayed on the giant. The staff nearby spoke in hushed tones, some pointing, others checking their tablets and cameras. One of them approached Eliza quietly and told her the bull had been acting differently for nearly a week, showing up near the deck every morning, standing still, waiting. He wasn't aggressive, just patient, as if searching for something. She didn't respond. Her gaze met the elephant's again. In that moment, something stirred deep inside her, something she hadn't felt since the day she released a young calf back into the wild 2 decades earlier. The memory was still buried in her chest like an unopened letter, sealed and silent for years. But now it was stirring. That afternoon, Eliza joined the rangers for a guided walk around the outer border of the sanctuary. She wore her old boots, still sturdy despite the worn soles. Her feet found the familiar rhythm of the path. The terrain was uneven, but the rangers moved with ease, and she followed, slower but determined. As they walked, she listened to them describe the layout of the sanctuary. The land stretched wide, fenced only at its farthest reaches where human encroachment threatened to seep in. The inner parts remained untouched, wild, a place where the animals roamed freely without strict barriers. The large bull had claimed part of the space as his territory, they explained, mostly keeping to himself but showing up at the borders more often lately. Eliza stayed quiet. Every step on the path brought back the rhythm of her younger days, of rushing toward injured animals, of days spent in makeshift medical tents, of nights sleeping on cots beside restless patients. Her mind drifted to the calf with the broken leg, the one she had carried in her arms while it cried from pain. That calf had looked at her with eyes too wise for its age. She had spent months with him, healing wounds, feeding by hand, and slowly earning his trust. They had named him Jabari, a strong name for a fragile soul. The word meant brave. Later, as the sun dipped lower, she returned to her lodge alone. The others stayed back to inspect the water tanks and fencing systems. Eliza welcomed the quiet. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat back on the porch chair. The light cast golden shadows across the land. Her gaze turned again to the field. The elephant was still there. This time he was closer. Not too near the fence, but enough that she could see his eyes more clearly. He didn't trumpet. He didn't stomp. He simply stood and watched. Eliza felt her heart beating faster. Her fingers curled around the mug tightly, the steam rising past her face unnoticed. Something about the way he looked at her reminded her of a child trying to remember a face in a dream. She rose from the chair and stepped closer to the edge of the porch. The wood creaked under her weight and her knees tensed, but she held firm. The elephant took a few slow steps forward. Still no aggression, no warning signs. Just movement. Careful and slow. One of the younger staff members jogged up the trail, out of breath and excited. He explained they had reviewed old sanctuary files and matched some of the ear markings. This bull was one of the few calves that had been released 2 decades ago. Not many records remained, but there was a note about a calf rescued from a trap wound and cared for at a smaller facility before being transferred here. Eliza nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She had treated more than a dozen elephants in her time, but only one had remained with her after all these years. A light wind passed through the trees, rustling the leaves and stirring the grass. The elephant lifted his trunk, sniffed the air, and lowered it again. The moment felt suspended. The sun cast long shadows, turning the landscape into a canvas of gold and green. Eliza whispered a name under her breath, too soft for anyone to hear. She wasn't sure if it was true, but every part of her wanted to believe it. The eyes watching her were not just those of a wild animal. They were eyes that had once belonged to a frightened calf, lying in pain, looking to her for help. And now they were looking back with something close to recognition. The next morning brought with it a soft mist that clung to the grass and leaves. The sanctuary stirred to life slowly, with distant sounds of animal calls rising gently into the air. Eliza stood at her window, still in her robe, watching the shapes move through the haze. Among them, the large bull stood once again, unmoving and quiet, as if waiting for the day to begin with her arrival. After breakfast, she joined a small group of researchers heading to the eastern edge of the reserve. The plan was to observe some of the matriarch herds and assess their migration patterns. Eliza listened politely but didn't say much. Her thoughts remained elsewhere, drawn back again and again to the elephant that had been appearing every day. Something in her resisted speaking about it too openly, as though putting words to it might break whatever fragile thread existed between them. As they reached a quiet clearing by a shallow stream, one of the researchers passed her a pair of binoculars. Eliza accepted them and scanned the tree line. Elephants moved gently through the brush, ears flapping and trunks reaching for leaves. Calves stayed close to their mothers, occasionally stumbling on awkward legs. The peaceful rhythm of their movements soothed her. Then she spotted him again. The bull, standing alone near the bend of the stream, half hidden by trees. She adjusted the focus. His tusks slightly uneven. His ears, one with a distinct tear near the edge. That detail caught her off guard. She lowered the binoculars and felt her breath tighten. She remembered that injury. A jagged cut torn by a poacher's snare, cleaned and stitched by her own hands in a field tent lit by lanterns. She hadn't thought about it in years, but the sight of it now brought back the image of herself younger, kneeling beside a bleeding calf as it whimpered in pain. The ears had flapped just like that then, nervous but trusting. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The ceiling fan hummed gently above her and the crickets chirped outside, but her mind would not quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her suitcase closer, unzipping the side pouch she hadn't opened since arriving. Inside was a small leather journal, faded, creased, and full of entries from her final year in the field. She turned the pages slowly. Notes about medication dosages, behavioral changes, feeding times. In between the technical pages were scribbled thoughts, sketches, and dates circled with heavy ink. She found an entry marked with a yellow ribbon. It was dated 20 years ago. The handwriting was hurried, almost shaky. Young male elephant brought in today. Approximately 8 to 10 months old. Severe leg wound from a metal snare. Dehydrated, high fever. Ear torn, possible permanent damage. Fearful but responsive. Needs constant monitoring. She traced the words with her finger, then turned the page. He responded well to the first few treatments. Eats better now. No signs of infection. I've been calling him Jabari. As she read further, the entries grew warmer. Descriptions of the calf following her from one side of the tent to the other, resting his head against her back when she sat. She had even sketched him once, ears too large for his head, trunk curled up mid-yawn. The drawing made her smile, but also filled her with a tightness in her chest. The journal closed with a soft thud. She placed it on the nightstand, then walked out to the porch. The night air was cooler, and the sky was dark, scattered with stars. The field beyond the lodge was quiet, except for one figure standing still under the moonlight. He was there again. Not moving. Not eating. Just watching. The moon reflected off his back, outlining his massive shape against the darkness. Eliza stood silently, not stepping closer, not calling out. She didn't need to. The connection, if it was real, didn't require sound. Just presence. She stayed until the elephant turned slowly and walked back into the trees. The next day, she asked for access to the sanctuary's old records. One of the senior staff members hesitated but eventually brought her to a small archive room filled with folders and digital logs. She explained her reasons, carefully avoiding any specific claims. She just wanted to check on some of the older rescue reports. Hours passed as she sifted through files, scanning pages, comparing details. Many calves had been brought in during the years she worked. Some stayed longer than others. A few had survived difficult recoveries, but many did not. Eventually, she found the file she had hoped for. Jabari. Male. Ear injury, left side. Snare wound to leg. Transferred from smaller center after stabilization. Released into wild in 2004. The paper clip to the back of the file included a faded photo. The calf's eyes were wide, his trunk curled, one ear clearly torn. Her chest tightened again as she stared at the image. She couldn't be entirely sure, not without confirmation. But every piece felt like it was clicking into place. She returned the file to the drawer and stepped outside. The sky was overcast and the air smelled of distant rain. Somewhere out there in the dense green, the elephant with the torn ear roamed freely. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if the bond they had shared had truly endured all this time. The rain arrived before dawn, soft at first, then steady, falling in rhythmic patterns against the roof of the lodge. Eliza stayed indoors that morning, sitting near the window with a blanket over her lap, listening to the water strike the leaves outside. The fields beyond were shrouded in mist once again, and the usual movement of animals was harder to see. Still, she kept her eyes on the distant tree line, half hoping the familiar figure would emerge despite the weather. Later that day, the rain slowed and the clouds parted just enough to let slivers of light touch the soaked ground. One of the younger rangers knocked on her door with a suggestion. The roads were too slick for the jeeps, but there was an old wooden shelter near one of the older rehabilitation zones. It had once been used to house injured animals during storms. Eliza remembered it from years ago, though she had assumed it had long since fallen apart. The ranger offered to walk her there if she wanted to see it again. She agreed without hesitation. They walked slowly, boots sinking into the wet earth. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, but familiar. Eliza could still picture the early days, her younger self rushing through the same path, medical bag bouncing against her back, breath heavy from urgency. The past clung to these trees like moss. The shelter appeared just as she remembered it, though time had softened its edges. The wooden frame was intact, though faded. The canvas panels once used to shade animals from the sun still hung loosely on one side. Eliza stepped inside and ran her hand along the beams, recalling the long nights she had spent here, keeping watch over patients too weak to be moved. And then the memories came. She had found him near the southern fence line, barely breathing, his leg twisted unnaturally and blood caking his side. The poacher's snare had dug deep into the soft flesh above his knee and flies had already begun to settle. He couldn't stand. His cries were hoarse and infrequent, more exhausted than fearful. She had rushed forward without thinking, waving the others back to keep him calm. They had lifted him onto a makeshift sling and brought him here, to this shelter. She remembered kneeling beside him as the others stepped out, giving her space to work. The wound was worse than she'd expected. The metal wire had cut nearly to the bone. It took hours to clean, stitch, and dress it. All the while, the calf had lain still, eyes wide and wet, trunk occasionally brushing against her sleeve. He didn't fight. He didn't cry. He just watched her as if trying to understand why someone would bother saving something that could no longer run. The following days were uncertain. He refused food. Fever set in. She tried every method she knew, injecting fluids, preparing special feed, singing softly when the fever spikes came. She slept in a chair just a few feet away, waking at every sound. And then one morning he had lifted his head and reached out with his trunk, curling it gently around her forearm. It was the first moment he had shown any strength. She had frozen, staring at him, then slowly leaned closer, letting him explore her face with careful movements. That was the day she gave him his name. He started improving soon after. Eating small portions. Standing with help. Limping across the shelter floor to lean his weight against her side. His trust came slowly but deeply. He began to follow her outside when she cleaned, dragging his bandaged leg with determination. The other staff joked that he had adopted her, not the other way around. Weeks turned into months. His wounds healed, though the tear in his ear remained. A reminder. The scar across his leg would always be visible. But he learned to walk again. To graze. To explore beyond the shelter's edge. The day of his release had arrived too quickly. Eliza had stood beside the open gate, watching as he hesitated, then took his first steps into the open world. He had turned once to look at her, ears flapping slightly, before disappearing into the trees. That was the last time she saw him. Until now. The rain began again, softly tapping against the canvas. Eliza turned away from the memories and stepped outside the shelter. The ranger waited a few steps down the path, giving her space. She didn't speak as they made their way back to the lodge, but inside her, the past echoed with every step. Later that night, the elephant returned. She saw him through the mist just before darkness fully settled. He stood alone, closer than usual, trunk swaying gently as if tasting the air. Her chest tightened. She stepped onto the porch, hands resting on the wooden railing. He didn't move. She didn't speak. The silence between them was filled with memory. The next morning, the sky was clear. A soft breeze swept across the field, bending the tall grass and rustling the low branches near the edge of the reserve. Eliza rose early, drawn from her bed by something unspoken. She stepped outside with a thermos of tea, wrapped in a light shawl, and moved slowly to the same spot on the porch where she had stood the night before. The field was quiet, still soaked from the previous day's rain. Sunlight poured over the landscape in golden streaks, drying the earth and waking the trees. She scanned the horizon, half expecting the large elephant to be there again, but the field was empty. Not a single figure stood in sight. She remained there for a while, sipping her tea, watching for movement. The morning passed slowly. Staff walked by now and then, offering small waves and polite greetings. A few mentioned the summit taking place later that afternoon, and someone handed her a folder with the schedule. She accepted it but didn't open it. As the day went on, she walked through the sanctuary grounds alone. The familiar dirt paths led her past the nursery pens where a few orphaned calves were being bottle-fed by caretakers. Their small, clumsy bodies and wide eyes brought a soft smile to her face. One of them reached its trunk through the fence toward her, and she let it curl around her fingers gently. The calf pulled back quickly and sneezed, startling itself. She laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. Farther down the path, she stopped at a small stone bench shaded by an acacia tree. She sat there, watching the hills in the distance. A pair of giraffes moved slowly across the ridge, their heads barely visible above the tall shrubs. Tom slipped by unnoticed until the sound of soft footsteps on the dirt alerted her to someone approaching. It was one of the guides, holding a camera in one hand and a radio in the other. He paused, catching his breath, and explained that the elephant, the same bull she'd seen each day, had been spotted again. This time he was closer, far beyond his usual range, walking alone near the edge of the central grounds. Staff were concerned but not alarmed. He wasn't acting aggressively. He was simply moving slowly in one direction as if looking for something. Eliza stood without hesitation and followed the guide. They moved quickly, passing the outer enclosures and crossing a footbridge above a narrow stream. The trees thickened ahead and the sunlight filtered through in scattered patterns. As they reached a clearing, the guide raised his hand, signaling her to stop. There he was. The elephant stood at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow. His head turned slowly toward them. The moment he saw her, he took a step forward. Then another. His trunk lifted slightly, hovering in the air. No sound, no trumpet, just that quiet gesture. She stepped forward on her own. The guide stayed behind, watching carefully but not interfering. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the elephant. Her feet moved over the uneven ground with caution, but her pace never faltered. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. Dust lifted around her shoes. Her breath came slow and steady. As she reached the edge of the clearing, the elephant stopped walking. They stood only 20 feet apart now. Close enough to see the ridges on his skin, the faint scarring near his leg, and the distinctive tear in his ear. The wind carried a scent that was both wild and familiar, earth, bark, and something older. She took one more step. Then, slowly, the elephant extended his trunk. It hovered in the space between them, swaying lightly. She didn't move right away. Her hands stayed at her sides. But her gaze remained steady, watching the trunk as it inched closer, like it was searching for something it had once known. When it reached her, it didn't touch her face or her hands. Instead, it hovered over her chest, pausing at the scarf draped over her shoulder. Then it dropped lower, curling gently around her wrist. She didn't flinch. Her fingers turned slowly, brushing the rough skin of his trunk. A long breath passed through her lips. Her other hand rose to meet the trunk, resting lightly on top of it. No words were spoken. No signals exchanged. But something passed between them in that touch. A question, an answer, and everything in between. She felt the years collapse. He stepped closer now, gently bringing his head down until it was level with hers. His eyes, dark and deep, blinked once, then stayed open, unblinking, watching her the same way he had watched from a mat on the shelter floor all those years ago. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full of memory. Then, with a sound so soft it almost didn't register, the elephant let out a low, vibrating rumble. It was the same sound he had made the first night he slept without pain, curled beside her in the old wooden shelter. Not a trumpet, not a call for help. It was comfort. Recognition. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. And in that moment, she knew. He had not forgotten. Eliza remained still, her hand resting gently against the elephant's trunk. Around them, the forest seemed to fall silent, as if even the birds and insects paused to observe. The air felt heavier now, not with heat or weight, but with something invisible. A presence too large to explain. The moments stretched out between them as though the past were unfolding again in real time. The elephant stepped back slightly, lowering his trunk, then raised it again, but this time in a motion so specific, so deliberate, that Eliza froze. He curled it inward, then lifted it high, letting it sway before holding it still near his eye. It was a gesture she hadn't seen in 20 years, one she had taught him during the long days of recovery. When he was too weak to walk and boredom left him restless, she had trained him with small movements, guiding his trunk with her hands, encouraging him to lift it in return for soft pats and fruit. He had always performed the gesture when he was excited or pleased. It became a greeting, something between them that no one else understood. Now, watching him do it again, fully grown and towering above her, she could feel her legs weaken. The edges of her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't blink them away. She let them fall. A few staff members had gathered at a distance, keeping still so as not to disrupt what was unfolding. They had cameras, radios, and whispered conversations among themselves, but Eliza barely registered any of it. All she could see was the gentle movement of the elephant's ears, the subtle tilt of his head, the way his body remained loose, not tense. He was not afraid. She stepped forward again, shortening the space between them until she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again as she reached up and placed both hands against the side of his face. Her palms rested on the warm, rough skin just below his eye. He didn't move. His large frame remained still, but a low rumble passed through him once more. The sound vibrated through her hands and chest. Memories rose unbidden. She could see him as a calf again, his head wrapped in cloth, legs bandaged, his body barely able to stand. She could hear the way he had stumbled through the shelter, crashing into her equipment but never running from her. She remembered the nights she stayed awake watching him breathe, fearing each time that he might not wake in the morning. Now he was here, alive, strong, and standing before her with the same gentleness he had once shown in sickness. He stepped back again, only slightly, and turned his head toward the trees. His ears twitched once, then twice. Eliza watched, unsure of what he sensed. A moment later, he let out a trumpet, louder this time, but still measured. The sound echoed off the trees and into the open field. From the edge of the clearing, two shapes emerged. Smaller, but not calves. Young elephants, perhaps a few years old, walked cautiously toward them. Their steps were uncertain, their trunks swinging with curiosity. Eliza stepped back, watching the larger elephant turn toward them and stand between her and the two younger ones. For a moment, it seemed like he was shielding her. Then he turned his head and gave a soft trumpet in their direction. The two paused, then slowly came forward again. She stood still, her heart beginning to race again, this time not from fear or awe but from a realization forming in her chest. The young elephants were not just part of the herd. They were his. They stopped beside him, brushing against his side and reaching their trunks toward him. He lowered his head to one, then turned to nudge the other forward. As they moved closer to Eliza, the smaller one extended its trunk in her direction. It didn't touch her, but hovered near her hand, mimicking the same cautious movement she had seen so long ago in another elephant's eyes. She knelt slowly, letting her knees press into the damp earth. Her hands remained open, relaxed. The young elephants inched closer. One touched her hand lightly, then pulled back. The other stepped sideways, brushing against her shoulder with its trunk. She couldn't speak. Even if she had tried, no sound would have come out. The moment was too full. The larger elephant stood over them, silent, watchful. He didn't move, didn't interfere. It was as if he was introducing them. She looked up at him and nodded once, not as a gesture of thanks, but as a way of saying she understood. He had brought them to her. Not just to show them off, but to pass something on. And she accepted it. The next day, the sun rose into a cloudless sky. The land shimmered under its warmth and the air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant blossoms. Eliza walked slowly through the sanctuary paths, her steps careful but steady. Her joints ached more than usual, but she didn't mind. Her thoughts were still full from the day before, and every breath she took felt somehow heavier, as if her body were trying to hold onto something too large to contain. She had no specific destination in mind. Her feet simply moved, guided by memory and instinct. The paths twisted and narrowed, taking her beyond the usual viewing spots. Birds flitted through the trees, their songs crisp and high. Somewhere far off, a group of zebras trotted along a shallow ridge. But she wasn't focused on them. The ground beneath her turned uneven. She adjusted her pace, watching each step. The canopy above provided shade, but the humidity clung to her skin. Her shirt was damp at the back, her breath slower. She paused beneath a fig tree, letting herself rest, leaning her hand against the rough bark for balance. A sound rustled nearby. Not a threat, just the ordinary crack of branches under something large. She looked through the trees and caught a glimpse of a familiar shape moving through the brush. It was him again. The large elephant, just beyond the ridge. He wasn't moving fast, only meandering along the slope as though following the same path she had taken. She turned to step back onto the trail, her foot pressing down on a rock half buried in the dirt. It shifted under her weight. Her other foot instinctively slid forward, but there was nothing to catch it. Her balance gave out. She hit the ground hard. The fall was sharp, jarring. Her hip struck first, then her knee twisted awkwardly beneath her. A sharp pain shot through her leg. She gasped and stayed where she was, teeth clenched. Her hands pushed against the ground, trying to brace her weight, but the pain spread too quickly. Her breath grew short. The world tilted slightly. She reached for her small radio clipped to the side of her belt. It had been tucked tightly, but the fall had knocked it loose. She grabbed it, pressed the button, and spoke. Nothing. The battery light blinked once, then went dark. She leaned back against the tree, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth. The ache in her leg was worsening. She shifted her weight, but even the smallest movement sent a wave of pain through her side. The trail was quiet, too far from the main paths for anyone to hear. No footsteps, no voices. Just the wind brushing through the leaves. Then came the rumble. Not from her chest, but from the ground. A slow, deep vibration that moved through the soil. She felt it before she heard it, the familiar thump of heavy steps. The sound grew stronger with each passing second. Branches parted ahead. The elephant emerged. He paused when he saw her. His ears lifted slightly, his trunk reaching forward. She didn't move, still caught between pain and disbelief. He stepped closer, more carefully this time. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he understood something was wrong. She watched him approach, her heart beating fast now, not from fear, but from the rush of being found. He stopped just a few feet from where she sat. His trunk lowered and touched the ground beside her, brushing the grass near her leg. Then it moved up gently until it hovered near her knee. She flinched slightly as the pain reminded her of its presence, but she didn't push him away. He didn't try to lift her. Not at first. Instead, he stayed there, watching her with eyes so still they seemed carved from stone. She reached up and touched his trunk, whispering something not meant for words. Just a quiet sound meant only for him. He moved then. Slowly, he lowered his trunk beneath her arm, curling it carefully around her middle. She felt her body lift off the ground, not roughly, not quickly, but with careful strength. Her injured leg dangled, the pain flaring for a moment, but it was bearable now. Her arms rested against the trunk that held her. He began to walk. The motion was smoother than she expected. Each step was gentle, not jarring. He moved through the trees with the same careful pace he had used when he first approached her days ago. She didn't know where he was taking her, but she trusted him. The elephant moved slowly through the trees, each of his steps steady and sure. Eliza lay nestled in the curve of his trunk, her injured leg bent awkwardly but supported. The pain had dulled into a steady throb, sharp only when she shifted too much. She tried to stay still, letting herself lean into the firm weight of the trunk wrapped around her middle. The forest passed around them like a dream. Branches arched overhead, filtering sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. Birds darted above, startled by the quiet presence moving through their space. Insects buzzed lazily near clusters of flowering shrubs. The only sound louder than the elephant's steps was the slow rhythm of her breathing. Time slipped away as he carried her. She had no way of knowing how long they had been walking. The direction was unfamiliar, and with her face pressed partly against his skin, she could only catch glimpses of the trail ahead. But there was no hesitation in his movement. He walked with purpose, as if he had taken this path before. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself drift. The warmth of his body and the sway of his steps gave her the strange sensation of floating. Her mind wandered to memories of the past, the days when she had walked alongside him as a calf, feeding him, tending to him, whispering to him when he was too weak to stand. She remembered his wide eyes, his awkward legs, the way he had once leaned against her as if she were the only solid thing in his world. Now the roles had reversed. A soft rustling pulled her attention back. The trees opened slightly and the dense foliage gave way to a wide clearing. In the center stood a narrow, shallow stream that wound through the clearing like a silver ribbon. She recognized it. This stream bordered the sanctuary's main grounds. They were close to the central path now, not far from where help would be. The elephant paused at the edge of the water and carefully set her down on a dry patch of grass. His trunk loosened around her with such gentleness that it almost felt like an embrace. She sat back against a sloping rock, drawing in a slow breath. Her leg ached deeply now that it was no longer supported, but she could feel the ground beneath her again. She was back. He stood beside her, his body blocking the harshest of the sun. His ears flicked lazily at the flies buzzing near his face. For a long moment, he simply stayed near her, unmoving, guarding her without any command or instruction. His presence alone was enough. Voices broke through the trees a short distance away. Eliza turned her head, squinting toward the sound. A group of staff members emerged from the woods, moving quickly, some carrying medical kits, others with walkie-talkies raised. They called out as they spotted her, rushing to her side. Their eyes shifted between her and the elephant, wide with disbelief. They asked if she was hurt. She nodded. They asked if she could move. She shook her head. One of them knelt beside her and began examining the leg, speaking in low, calm tones. Another laid out a splint and started preparing a stretcher. She answered their questions quietly, all the while keeping her eyes on the elephant. He hadn't moved. He stood just a few paces away, watching the scene unfold. His eyes flicked from person to person, alert but not threatened. As the stretcher was positioned, Eliza felt a tremor in her chest, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that their moment was ending. This part of their journey together was done. He had brought her back. He had done what she once did for him. When they lifted her onto the stretcher, she winced. The pain flared, sharp and deep. A hand gripped hers gently, offering reassurance. They began carrying her back toward the path where the vehicle waited. She turned her head as far as she could to see him one more time. He remained where he was, standing at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow, half in sun. A low sound rumbled from his chest, barely audible over the wind. Not loud, not mournful. Just present. Their eyes met once more. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already passed between them. And he understood. The drive back to the main compound was slow and careful. The wheels of the utility vehicle rolled cautiously over the uneven ground as the staff focused on keeping Eliza steady. Her leg had been wrapped tightly, braced by splints and cushioned with rolled towels. The pain was manageable now, helped by the injection they'd administered before lifting her into the back of the vehicle. She lay against the padded bench, eyes half closed, but her mind was fully awake. The canopy of trees slipped by above her. Shadows flickered over her face, breaking apart in fragments as the sunlight filtered through. The voices of the team around her were low and calm. One of them, a young woman with a clipped accent, gave updates into her radio. Another rode beside Eliza, holding a cool cloth to her forehead and asking now and then if she needed anything. But Eliza said very little. Her thoughts remained fixed on the clearing, on the elephant who had carried her there, on the quiet understanding that had passed between them in every step and every glance. By the time they arrived at the compound, a small group had gathered outside the main building. Word had already spread. Eliza was carried gently inside and placed on a cot near the medical wing, a modest structure attached to the main facility. A doctor examined her again, confirming the knee had been dislocated but could heal with rest and proper care. The staff moved quickly, bringing ice packs and preparing a more permanent brace. One of the attendants brought her water, another a light blanket. She thanked them softly, though her mind stayed far from the room. Outside, the air had begun to shift. The afternoon sun had deepened into golden tones, casting long shadows across the ground. From her place near the open window, Eliza could hear the sounds of animals settling for the evening. Birds called from the trees, monkeys chattered somewhere in the distance. Somewhere beyond the walls, the elephants moved again. She sat up slowly, careful not to twist her injured leg. The doctor tried to insist she lie back, but she waved him off. He didn't argue long. A few minutes later, she heard the unmistakable sound of trumpeting. Not loud or frantic, but short and full-bodied. It echoed faintly through the grounds. Others heard it too, some looked up from their work, some paused in conversation. The sound came again, closer now. A long pause followed. Then another trumpet. This one smaller, sharper, more playful. She pushed herself to her feet with help from a crutch. She moved slowly, limping with effort toward the entrance of the building. A staff member rushed forward to assist her, guiding her toward the large wooden gate that opened to the inner yard where the enclosures met the wild edge of the reserve. The scene waiting beyond stopped her breath. 3 elephants stood just beyond the gate. He was there, his large frame unmoving, ears relaxed, trunk swaying slowly. The 2 young ones stood close by, one pressing against his leg, the other reaching for a low branch. The smaller of the 2 stepped forward first, trunk sniffing the air. The other followed a second later, more hesitant. Eliza leaned on her crutch and moved closer to the edge of the fence. The elephants didn't move. Then, slowly, the older bull stepped forward. He crossed the space with quiet power, stopping just short of the gate. His trunk reached through the wooden slats, brushing gently along the surface as if searching for her. She stepped closer. Their eyes met once more. Behind him, the younger elephants watched carefully. One took a few bold steps forward, then stopped, trunk raised in a mirrored motion of curiosity. The older elephant turned slightly, as if gesturing. The small one moved closer again, trunk extended, reaching toward the gap in the gate. Eliza lowered herself to one knee and held out her hand. The young elephant sniffed, then touched her palm lightly. Its trunk was warm and delicate, still clumsy, but eager to understand. The older one stood quietly behind, unmoving, waiting. The second young elephant followed, approaching slowly, then reaching through to touch her other hand. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't blink them away. These were his children. He had brought them here, not just to see her, but to share something deeper. A story passed down not through words, but through gestures, through presence, through memory. She reached up and touched the larger elephant's trunk again. He rumbled softly in reply. It was enough. Eliza remained at the fence for a long time. The sun dropped lower in the sky and the golden light began to fade into the soft blue of dusk. The two young elephants stayed close, occasionally brushing her hands with their trunks, their movements curious but never frantic. The older bull stood behind them, unmoving, his eyes never leaving her. He watched in silence as his children touched the woman who had once saved him. There was no need to explain anything. Everything was understood in the quiet. Eventually, one of the staff stepped forward and gently reminded Eliza it was time to return to the lodge. The day was ending and the temperature was beginning to fall. She nodded and rose slowly, her crutch supporting her weight. Before turning away, she reached once more toward the elephant's trunk and let her fingers rest there for a moment. He responded by curling the tip of his trunk around her wrist in the same careful way he had done when he found her injured. Then he let go. She walked back in silence, her steps slower than before, not from pain, but from the weight of farewell. The staff didn't speak. They followed quietly, giving her space. The path back to the lodge felt shorter now, though the trees and grass were the same. When she reached the steps, she paused and turned, hoping to see him again. He was still there, standing at the same spot near the gate, framed by the fading light, watching her go. She raised her hand slightly, a simple gesture. He didn't respond right away. Then, with deliberate calm, he raised his trunk toward the sky, paused, and lowered it again. The next morning, she began preparing to leave the sanctuary. Her leg was still healing, but the brace had made it easier to move. The staff offered to extend her stay, but she declined with a smile. She had seen what she needed to see. Her room was filled with small items she had unpacked but barely touched: books, a shawl, and old field notebook. She folded each item carefully, packing them away with quiet precision. When the time came to leave, the jeep pulled up near the lodge. Staff members gathered to say goodbye, some shaking her hand, others offering warm embraces. They spoke of how honored they were to have her visit, how her presence had reminded them of why they did the work they did. She thanked them all, though her thoughts were elsewhere. As the engine started and the vehicle began to roll forward, she turned to look back at the sanctuary one last time. The trees stood still, their branches catching the wind gently. Birds flew overhead. Somewhere beyond the brush, elephants moved in slow procession. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. The flight home was long, and the landscape changed quickly beneath the plane. From grasslands to city lights, from scattered trees to crowded streets. But through all of it, her mind stayed rooted in that clearing. In the sound of distant trumpeting. In the feeling of a trunk wrapped gently around her waist. Back in her small farmhouse, everything was where she had left it. The garden needed watering, the floors had gathered dust, and the wind had blown leaves across the porch. She moved through the rooms with slow care, setting things back into place. But something inside her had changed. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt earned. She pulled out her old leather journal from the drawer and added a new page. The entry was short, written with steady hand. He remembered. She placed the journal back where it belonged and stepped outside. The wind brushed against her face, and in the distance she thought she heard something. It wasn't real, of course. Just the rustling of trees or the low hum of a passing car. But in her heart, the sound was unmistakable. A trumpet. Soft and full of memory. Somewhere, across the world, the elephant she had once saved was walking beneath the same sky. With every step, he carried the story they had shared and now passed on to the next generation. The bond remained. Quiet. Unbroken.